One of the questions I hear most often from my students is how to choose colors for my paintings. And today we'll talk about paints to use, how to create an abundance of colors, and how to choose colors for your paintings. So by the end of this video, you'll have tips for choosing and using colors in your own paintings. And we'll keep it simple. Only 4 or 5 paints are needed. So favorite colors, my favorite colors for painting animals, Winsor Newton is the brand. French ultramarine blue, burnt umber, sometimes burnt sienna, which is more reddish, yellow ochre, Winsor lemon, and permanent rose for those pinkish noses and tongue and gums and things like that. And I like to keep it simple. Just keep it those colors because you can create so much just by mixing and layering those colors. So let's move right into suggestions for mixing and layering. Let's talk about grays and blacks first. I like to create grays and blacks, just like these paintings, using a mix of French ultramarine blue and burnt umber or burnt sienna. And I like to use these colors because, first of all, when you mix the blue and the brown, you can create so many different kinds of grays and blacks, like bluish black, brownish black, and all kinds of browns of all different characters. And these colors are forgiving. It's easy to soften these colors when they're wet and when they've dried, and you can lift the color even when it's dried. And you can create nice, rich, dark values by layering the color. You can create so many different kinds of browns just using burnt umber and burnt sienna. Now, burnt sienna is a little more reddish. You see this fox? I used burnt sienna in that. I used burnt umber in the goat. So burnt umber and burnt sienna are the base colors. And if I want to go darker, I add a little bit of ultramarine blue to the brown. And the more blue you add, the darker the brown will become until eventually it becomes gray. Those are all colors created just by combining blue and brown. Consistency. Think about thinner consistencies like tea to thin milk. You can create a lighter brown, as in this cat. The lightest value of this cat is very pale brown, the consistency of tea. It's burnt umber. And the darker browns were created by mixing burnt umber with a bit of ultramarine blue. You can also layer thin layers of brown, one on top of the other, dry between each layer to create darker browns, as I did in this little color chart. At the top of the chart, there's one layer of burnt umber on the left side, the consistency of tea to water. And then moving lower, I allow each layer to dry, and I just kept layering and layering and was able to create darker values. You can also create a golden brown by alternating layers of yellow ochre or sometimes Winsor lemon with layers of burnt umber or burnt sienna. You want to dry between each layer, and you can create kind of an orange golden brown, such as this eye, using burnt sienna because burnt sienna is a little more reddish. Another technique for creating darker browns is you can start with gray. And when it's dry, you can lay burnt umber or sometimes slightly darker browns on top of the gray, and that will change the character of the color. Or you could do it the other way around. You could lay in brown first and then lay in gray on top of it, and that will change the brown. To create a tan, I use either yellow ochre or burnt umber. Very, very pale consistencies of tea, maybe thin milk. So the cat, the lightest value is very pale burnt umber. The cat on the right, the lightest value, I think, is yellow ochre layered with burnt umber. In the dog, in the face, the lightest part is very pale burnt umber. And then in the body and the neck, you're seeing layers of burnt umber and yellow ochre, and the grays and blacks are mixes of ultramarine blue and burnt umber. Now, pinks, to create like the nose and the mouth and the tongue and the gums. A mix of yellow ochre and permanent rose creates a really nice pinkish color. I use that for skin tones in humans too. You add a little more yellow ochre or a little more pink, it changes the character of the color. And you can adjust the consistency and if you want to go darker, and you can also layer the color if you want to go darker. Those are the colors that I like to use, and those are the mixes and layers that I use to create an abundance of colors. But how do you choose the colors in your painting? Let's say you've got this awesome reference photo and you want to create a painting of it. What I do is I ask myself, what colors do I see? What colors should I use? And how do I create those colors? Those are the three things. Let's talk about this. And I'm using this dog as an example. I've got this side close to being finished. I'm ready to move into final refinements, and I still need to give attention to this side. It's a pretty complex painting, so I broke it down into smaller parts. And when choosing colors, I started with, what colors do you see just generally in the eyes, in the nose, in the mouth, including the teeth, the tongue, the gums? What colors do you see in the ears, the head, the body? Now, for the head and body, I'm seeing browns, tans, grays, blacks, and there is some white fur. Look above the eyes, between the nose and the mouth, but it's actually very pale gray. Now that you've got an idea of the colors that you might want to use, let's break it down into smaller parts. Think about, what are the lightest colors? What are the darkest colors? And what are the in-between colors? The midtones are the colors that are not the darkest or the lightest. For the lightest color, look underneath and through the darker fur. And the lightest color I'm seeing is along the edge of the head. It seems to be a pale tan, maybe a hint yellowish. And then in the center of the face, I'm seeing the lightest color is very pale gray. And even that white fur above the eyes is very pale gray. So those are the lightest colors that I'm seeing. Then what are the darkest colors? In the head and body, the darkest color I'm seeing is black. Between the eyes, really dark value, black. Look at the right ear, that's black, might be a little brownish. So then move to the midtones. These are the colors in between darkest and lightest. In the center of the face, I'm seeing all different kinds of grays. As we move outward and lower, I'm seeing dark browns and lighter browns and tans, and I'm seeing some golden browns. So now you have an idea of what you're seeing, and we got to figure out how to create the colors. And I encourage you to experiment first. It's definitely worth taking the time to experiment. Just pick a small part of the photo and say, I'm not sure about that. I'm going to experiment first. Try different techniques. Layering, mixing, playing with consistency. So here's my plan for this dog. For the lightest values of the fur, I'm going to use pale yellow ochre or pale burnt umber. I don't think I'm going to use burnt sienna because that's a little too reddish. And then I would use a pale gray mix of ultramarine blue and burnt umber for the lightest value of gray, and the white's going to be very pale gray. So now I have a plan for the lightest colors. For the black, I'm going to use a mix of ultramarine blue and burnt umber. And I'm going to layer, layer, layer until I'm happy with the depth of color. In the center of the head, for the grays, I'm seeing a lot of grays, like between the eyes and right above the nose to the sides of the nose. I'm going to use that mix of ultramarine blue and burnt umber, slightly thinner consistencies, because they're not going to be as dark. For tan, I'm going to use yellow ochre. For a golden tan, I'm going to use yellow ochre layered with Winsor lemon. For the browns, I'm going to use burnt umber. And I know I can go darker by adding a bit of ultramarine blue. You could also layer like gray with brown if you want to go darker. And if I want to create a golden brown, I'll apply thin layers of yellow ochre, I think is what I'm using. Although I think I experimented with some Winsor lemon in this too. So the summary of colors: ultramarine blue, burnt umber, yellow ochre, a tiny, tiny bit of Winsor lemon. Let's take a look at a couple more examples of subjects you might encounter in your own paintings. And if you have a specific question about a dog or a cat or any animal, if you're not quite sure what to do about the colors, leave a comment or feel free to email me. I'm happy to help. Let's begin with these white dogs. Ask yourself, what colors do I see? I'm seeing white, some brown, especially around the nose and mouth. And in the mouth, I'm seeing pink, some black, gray, and even brownish in the shadow. So what colors would you use? For the grays and blacks, I used a mix of ultramarine blue and burnt umber. And you can adjust the amount of blue or brown in the mix to make the gray appear more brownish or more bluish. In a white animal, the slightly darker values in the fur are actually very pale gray. And when you use a very thin consistency, you can create those slightly darker grays within the white fur while retaining the character of a white dog. For the brown, I'll use burnt umber. And for the pinkish color in the mouth, I'll use a mix of permanent rose and yellow ochre. I experimented with these colors, creating a study of this dog. This dog also contains white fur, but it's a little bit different. So what colors do you see? I'm seeing white and also very pale brown, pale gray, and in the mouth and nose area, black, gray, and that pinkish color. I kept the lightest part of the fur, the white of the paper. To create the pale browns in the ear and in the neck, I used thin consistencies of burnt umber. For the pale gray and the black, that mix of ultramarine blue and burnt umber. And for the pink tongue and gums, the mix of permanent rose and yellow ochre. What colors do you see for this golden cat? I'm seeing white, very pale tan, different kinds of browns. I'm seeing pinks in the nose, in the ears, and around the mouth. Black in the eyes. What colors to use? The white fur actually contains very pale gray, and I would use the mix of ultramarine blue and burnt umber, a thin consistency like tea to water. To create the slightly golden tans and browns, I used thin layers of burnt umber layered with yellow ochre. For the grays and blacks, that mix of ultramarine blue and burnt umber. And for the pinks, the permanent rose and yellow ochre. What colors are you seeing in this Boston Terrier? I'm seeing different values of black and gray and white, and some pinks. The white parts contain a very pale gray, that gray mix of ultramarine blue and burnt umber. For the different values of black and gray, I use that same mix of blue and brown. And for the pinks, permanent rose and yellow ochre. Isn't it amazing the abundance of subjects that you can create just using 4 or 5 colors? And there you have it, tips for choosing and using colors in your own paintings. I hope you found this video helpful. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.